As of the published date of this episode, I am an associate of Ulta Beauty. The ideas and thoughts represented here are my own and not that of my employer. Welcome to the Scaling Emerging Beauty Podcast, a podcast that provides actionable insights for brands that are looking to scale from 0 to 20 million at big retail. I am so excited for y'all to hear today's conversation. I was joined by Zach Stewart of the Emerson Group to talk about consumer insights yet again. Here's a snippet from our conversation.
We, as insights managers and leaders, always be curious and always be learning, right? Whether it's whatever consumers are doing next, whatever retailers are doing next, whatever some of these, ecosystems, social media is doing next. I think you always have to be curious and you always have to be, willing to learn whatever that next thing is. You can never be static and always just be willing to try new things because you never know what's going to work for the brand.
Now let me tell you a little bit more about Zach. Zach has been with the Emerson Group for 4 years, mainly in the consumer insight space. Prior to joining the Emerson Group, Zach worked for a few brands in the CPG space. Our conversation today spanned a variety of topics, including currently trending topics on social media. We also touched a little bit on GLP-1 drugs. Have you all heard of Ozempic? And how certain trends that seem like a small trend actually have longer-term impacts on the actual CPG industry that we're in. I'm so excited for y'all to hear this conversation today, and that's exactly what you'll hear after a word from our sponsor. Enjoy. I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor for the Scaling Emerging Beauty Podcast, the Emerson Group. Through their support, we're able to continue to talk to industry experts to provide early stage brands with strategies and tactical insights on what they can do to help their business grow better. Thank you again to the Emerson Group for their continued support. And let's go ahead and continue with the show. Thank you, Zach. I'm so excited to have you on the show because I recall the importance of category managers and the insights that they were able to provide on not only the category, but also like how brands might be changing or how overall retail might be shifting. And so I thought, let's get you on here to just talk overall category insights, talk a little bit about retail and some interesting things that I've noticed recently or somewhat recently, we'll say as of this recording, which is like August of 2024. But some of the things that we'll discuss might not necessarily be as timely when it publishes, but I definitely think it will still be relevant in terms of just how folks can look at the industry, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to start off by just talking about generations. I am so fascinated by like Gen Z, millennials, boomers. So I would love for you to just start off by sharing some high level insights about the shopping habits for these different generations. If you are seeing any noticeable differences across the generations, or, if folks are lumping folks together. I know I see tons of social media commentary about Gen Z versus millennials and boomers. So I'd love to see if any of this transfers over into shopping habits.
Yeah, great question. I mean, obviously, I think we're, as insights professionals, trying to kind of unpack this, every single day. And, the roadmap, so to speak, keeps constantly changing, right, as generations kind of adopt new patterns and whatnot. But I think I'll kind of talk through, kind of the 4 distinct generations that we kind of think about from an insights perspective and talk about in macro how we see those generations. But then there's always going to be nuances, right? There's going to be little subgroups within each of these generations. And I'll try to cover off on some of those too that we're seeing, within each of these age groups. So I think starting off with our youngest, probably most exciting generation that everyone is kind of talking about, Generation Z. So these consumers really are, the digital natives. They're much more compatible with many of these digital platforms that many of us have adopted later on in life. But for them, it's been, something they've been continuously using for a number of years, right? They just kind of grew up with it. And that can be shopping platforms or social media for product discovery, things like that. Even like, what's crazy is we're kind of watching, just how much influence influencers can have on product discovery and really kind of, getting consumers excited about a brand. And this is particularly true, with Generation Z, which is also interesting because, at the Emerson Group, we have interns or, kind of younger colleagues and whatnot, throughout given periods of time, and just kind of picking their brain is always kind of fun. And they, reiterate a lot of these that you see in more Mintel reports or whatnot, things like that. I think in terms of like some subgroups that we're seeing within this, there's really a lot of diversity within this age group. So there's a lot of nuance in terms of, how these different consumers are kind of thinking. It can be, socioeconomic backgrounds, or, some of these, consumers are coming from multi-generational households. Really just kind of a lot of interesting, diversity that they particularly have compared to some of the other generations. From there, I'll go ahead and jump into millennials and cover up on that a little bit. I think, millennials, obviously the next generation up, tech savvy, right? I think that, while they didn't necessarily grow up with it, they've had it now for a pretty good amount of time, and they're very experienced with it, in terms of online shopping, using technology to, look at, ratings and reviews. Definitely more research oriented generation. So they're looking forward to kind of see what other consumers, you're kind of looking for that social proof, so to speak. And then, I think what's kind of interesting about millennials is there's kind of the younger millennial cohort and the older millennial cohort, which is very kind of almost, I would say, like sub-generations, right? I am a younger millennial cohort. So, I don't have a family. I don't have a house. I don't have a lot of those things that I think a lot of the older millennial generation does.
Like me. I call myself a geriatric millennial all the time. I have 4 kids. And let me tell you, it's different.
It is. And, even though we're in the same generation, we're experiencing, the world through, very different lenses. And I think all of that kind of reigns true in terms of, products that you're, engaging with, products that you're researching. I mentioned earlier, I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I don't have a car. I kind of do, the mass transit commute to work and whatnot, whereas, you having a house and family lifestyle and all that, it's very different, right? We have different engagements with different product categories and whatnot. So I do think that that's kind of an interesting, almost like sub generation that needs to be kind of called out. Generation X, again, I think that these consumers are, getting and are more so comfortable with technology and online shopping. Definitely a balance within store, though, more so than other generations, and boomers will also kind of have that, but even more so favoring in-store. I've definitely kind of noticed this trend around value for money with Generation X. They're definitely more pragmatic shoppers, looking for that, good value and good quality. Brand loyalty is also a pretty big thing with this generation, as opposed to some of the other generations, especially younger. I think younger generations are more willing to kind of rapidly change through brands and not so exclusive. I think also, this generation here is kind of also referred to as kind of the sandwich generation, right? They're kind of balancing responsibilities of having younger kids at home, but then also possibly taking care of their parents and whatnot. So definitely they're engaging with a lot of different categories that maybe they're not the user of, but they're trying to research it and ultimately, kind of buy the best product that is the right for their family member or whatnot that they're trying to take care of ultimately. Obviously, I think, with that, there just goes to be a lot of lifestyle changes that this group is experiencing, right? As there's just a lot of dynamicness happening around them for those that they are kind of caring for and whatnot, and family life and all that. And then finally, boomers, kind of the last group that we typically look at from our role of category insights, but much more focused on kind of traditional preferences in terms of in-store shopping. Obviously, we have seen some increase in online penetration for this particular age group, but in totality, they very much prefer in-store shopping. They're also really big on kind of the brand they trust. I think for this generation of consumers, it's kind of like, it's been working for me for this long, I might as well just keep on going where it's going. A little bit of a subset within this group is kind of some price sensitivity, right? So a portion of this age group could be kind of on that retired fixed income mindset. So there could be some variation in terms of price sensitivity of how, some of those subgroups within the boomer generations are shopping for products and whatnot. So hopefully that was a short snippet overview, but obviously, you can really dive down into all these generations in a lot of nuance and detail. So.
Yeah, that was really good, Zach. And as I think about the things that you said, I think of the brand founders and how they can leverage some of those things to understand why there's still value in some of these older generations. I know a big focus for many retailers and also for many brands is to market things towards Gen Z especially, less millennials as we are getting a little bit older, and even hearing more about Gen Alpha. I mean, especially in beauty, you hear a lot of talk about Gen Alpha, but I think it's really helpful to remember that there's still a lot of buying power with the Xers, with the boomers, and some of these insights that you mentioned, like especially with Gen X being more of a sandwich generation where they might be caregivers for their parents and also still taking care of young children. There's a lot of dollars on the table there. And I think sometimes brands can be so focused on the younger folks that they forget that if you have a solid demographic with Gen X or the boomers, sometimes that's okay. Like, you can find other ways to grow, obviously, because that population isn't necessarily growing. That's why I say that. But you can find other ways to grow, be it innovation, be it trading things up, be it, separate brand sub launches, but other things. You can kind of get creative because you don't necessarily want to abandon that base.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think there's still a tremendous amount of unlock, with Gen X and the boomer generation in terms of value that can be created for brands. I know that it's the sexy, fun, exciting thing to go to Gen Alpha or Gen Z, but there is still, to your point, a lot of buying dollars that's locked up in the Gen X and the boomer generation. So I would say, if you have the ability to play in that generation, definitely continue to lean in there. Because again, some brands are chasing that next generation, and it may not always be, it may be more expensive to go after them. And try to convert them. So,
yeah, that's a great point. As I think about, we kind of talk generations. I'd love to talk a little bit about retail and the shifting roles, if you will, of retailers as selling models continue to evolve and change. We all know that, as of now, August 2024, there's TikTok Shop. There are easier ways for you to shop on Instagram and Facebook, more ways than before. And then, of course, there's also DTC. And I actually read an article from Bain & Company, and a direct quote from the article, which I will include in the show notes, is that by 2030, half of industry profits, talking retail profits, could come from non-traditional sources such as marketplaces, advertising, and financial services. And I'm thinking that advertising is including like retail media networks. So the retailers are still getting their piece of the pie. But given that this shift, I would love for you to talk about how brands should be preparing themselves for the shift. Should they be worried? I mean, 2030 is 5-ish years away. I haven't necessarily seen that shift thus far, but I'd love to get your take on how brands can prepare for this.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? I think, maybe there's been a little bit more kind of under the radar changes that have been happening, so to speak, in terms of how retailers are kind of shifting their revenue streams. I think that we know that retail in general, right, kind of known for operating on razor thin margins, right? Especially like something like a Walmart, right? It's all about volume and really low margins for the actual commerce trade, right, that they engage in. So, I think over time, we've seen retailers try to kind of diversify their revenue streams, right? I think about, healthcare, right? We've seen, CVS, Walgreens, Walmart, all have tried to enter healthcare, right, in terms of a kind of a primary, or an emergency need, so to speak. Some of those have panned out, right? Walmart, recently has exited that. But obviously, CVS does have, quite a large footprint, with a lot of their primary care centers. Digital marketplaces, I think you touched on that as one of the other avenues. But, famously, obviously Amazon, right, is the market leader in this place. But Walmart, kind of expanding their marketplace. And then even like some of these other, I'll call them tertiary revenue streams, right? Cloud services from Amazon Web Services generates an enormous amount of profit and revenue for them. So it's a way of, obviously diversifying the revenue stream, especially for Amazon, but possibly there's other, opportunities for cloud services within some of these other retailers. And then, as you mentioned, retail media, right? I think it seems like a new retailer or a new brick and mortar establishment launches a retail media network every week as of late. I think obviously the big ones, Amazon, Walmart, Target, Kroger. But I think it was like last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, something like that. Planet Fitness is launching a retail media network. So yeah, it is kind of
What
crazy.
are they going to do with that?
It's eyeballs on a screen, and it's a monetizable value. So I think it's definitely kind of an interesting evolution, so to speak, that we're seeing. But to get to your question, right, about brands and kind of thinking about, how brands can kind of adapt and get ready for this. I think on the one hand, this evolution is pretty exciting for brands, because there will be more opportunities to engage with consumers through these retail ecosystems, right? And you're also unlocking vast amounts of data, these brands, could potentially, purchase or have access to. All right, if I'm, Amazon, and I know, how frequently you're, going to the Amazon page, how long you're staying on, each individual page. Maybe I also know what you, watch on TV through Prime Video. Maybe I'm, able to connect with you through podcast and whatnot through, the Amazon Music platform. And I can have those touch points with you, right? You're kind of creating a closed circuit ecosystem, so to speak. So these brands could have more opportunities to engage with consumers more than just kind of that immediate point of purchase right at the physical shelf. But, how can you kind of engage with consumers through, digital marketplaces, retail media, and then even social platforms. Having said that, I think it is a bit worrisome for brands, right? As some of these different revenue streams that retailers are looking for, as retailers are relying less on that core trade, maybe there's an outcome where, in store, the space that is dedicated to true trade, true commerce goes down, right? Maybe a Walgreens and CVS dedicates more, physical retail space to services, right? Whether it's an eye care center or some kind of medical center or something like that, maybe they pull back some of these different things, and I think obviously all of that, is reducing the amount of in-store SKUs, reducing the amount of in-store brands, could be a threat to some of these brands, especially I think the smaller ones, right? The ones that don't quite have those enormous household penetrations, the ones that
these emerging brands.
Yeah. I mean, it could be, pretty detrimental to them, if they're not able to kind of really bring, that unique consumer to that retailer. So to get really far back to your question, how can brands really think about preparing for this evolution? So, one, I think really thinking about delivering that unique value for that retailer, right? The brand needs to bring that distinct consumer, needs to bring that distinct demographic, whatever it is they're really trying, that brand is really able to hold on to. And they need to bring that to the retailer. And it needs to be a valuable consumer for that retailer, right? If I'm only bringing in someone that comes into Walmart once a year, Walmart's not really going to care. But if I can really, show that market basket value of this person and show how they're, more engaged with not just the category, that the brand is in, but multiple categories, and talking about the total value of that shopper to Walmart, I think that's going to be a lot more impactful for that retailer and really trying to keep it on shelf. I think the other thing too is, and I think we'll, maybe touch on this a little bit later, in terms of like D2C for consumers, but what unique data can a brand bring to a retailer of kind of educating more so, right? Through that first party data that they have access to through their D2C site, how can that brand come with a little bit more of a unique lens to their consumer and help educate Walmart or any other retailer, about their consumer a little bit more and say, hey, we want to bring a unique lens and a unique value to you here, to kind of show you a little bit more about your own consumer here.
I love that, Zach. And I think it's a great segue or transition, because I was thinking about DTC and thinking, okay, if these marketplaces are going to be here, another thing that I heard was that DTC is going to be taking over physical stores. I mean, I remember when I got my MBA back in 2015, I graduated, and I remember some of my classmates saying, you're going into retail. There's not going to be any retail stores in 10 years. 10 years later, and there are still a lot of retail stores. Now, we know that there are a number of retailers going into bankruptcy and so on, but there's also retailers that are thriving and that are growing. Yeah. And so I'd love to understand how you're seeing the juggle and balance between DTC, omnichannel retail presence, the role of stores overall in commerce, and how brands should look at the role of DTC. I loved your comment about brands leveraging unique first-party data that they have from their DTC site to bring insights to retailers. but I'd love to just get your thoughts on like physical stores, DTC, omnichannel. How is that all interacting as we continue to move in this post-COVID, super interesting kind of world?
Great question. I think for many brands, it definitely has to be a balance. And it's a tough balancing act to maintain. I think obviously from a physical store perspective, retail stores obviously have the advantage of immense foot traffic. They're in a variety of different geographic locations that they can very easily attract a pretty diverse customer base, especially those that don't shop online or don't shop online as much or may not shop online for that given category that brand is in. I think what also retail stores offer is brand visibility, but also, what I'll call trustworthiness. There's almost kind of like that gatekeeper.
It's like a vetting.
Yeah.
Right?
Really
They pick them. So this must be like the best of the best or a really good option. Like there are even retailers who have like what we're loving or like the next, this cool thing. So yeah.
I mean, even I think about my own experience, right? On, if I think about like Amazon or something like that, like there's sometimes where you see product listings and I'm like, oh, that does not seem really legit. Like this seems a little too good to be true, or it's a little sketchy. I don't know. But like, yeah, there's definitely a vetting process that happens to get into physical retail. The buyer who is ultimately, or a merchant ultimately controlling what gets through, and they've likely tested the product. They've likely experienced the product before. So I do think, whether consumers, inherently know all that or whatnot, but I do think that there is kind of a seal of approval, so to speak, that gets kind of stamped by, showing up on the physical shelf in retail. I think the other benefit to a physical store, and some of this can happen for larger brands for sure, but, even more emerging brands, there's more kind of that impulse, right? If you happen to walk past a display or an end cap or something like that, that ability to, engage with the consumer, in one of those instances, you don't really get that on a true online marketplace. It's just hard to kind of really pull a consumer out of their normal search buying routine and try to get them to do something different. I think that's really, really difficult. So I think that obviously, in-store, retail kind of has that ability. D2C or online does not.
That's so good. And I think there's so much for brands to kind of keep in mind in terms of, as folks were saying, oh, this is all going to go away. I really do think the future of commerce is going to be omnichannel. And I think to your point, the stores are going to have a really important role of bringing that physical, like you can touch and feel and that sensory experience. You can smell it. All of those things that make us human, I say, that we enjoy, that you can't necessarily get online. But there still is the convenience of .com. So that's definitely not going away. So I do think there's going to be this fun back and forth relationship between the physical stores and the .com presence, this digital presence. And I think as more marketplaces, I know for a minute, people were talking about the metaverse and how that was going to take things over. We saw I feel like it was a little more hype than it was reality, right? Because even as I think about my teenagers, like showing me her little thing on Roblox, I don't know that she's going to the stores and things like that the way that we were thinking folks would. But it is cool to kind of see how brands might activate, how they might show up, and how they might be able to still make connections to the consumer so that whether or not it leads to sales, who knows? But it is this interesting new dynamic I find with this omnichannel presence.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great point also. Is I think that in addition to kind of using the word omnichannel, more recently, right? I think we've also started talking, that commerce is really kind of omnipresent now. If you think about, just how much commerce is tied into social media nowadays. You don't necessarily just go to like a shopping app to shop. You go to a social media app, you watch an influencer's page. It's kind of always there, kind of this always on mentality now. Brands kind of have to think about being on all the time. They have to think about being in every location that a possible consumer could find your brand, have the problem or whatnot. Even like thinking about, as consumers go online to research, different things. We know that a lot of, I think Target is probably one of the best in class at this, is that there's an enormous amount of sales that start online and they may actually pick up in store or have some kind of engagement with the store through that online order. But we know that there's a large amount of sales that are facilitated, through their online platform. And I think it's important for brands to think about, that consumers are kind of engaging all the time, potentially with their brand assets out there, and they have to make sure and be everywhere for consumers to have that positive touch point and continue down that purchase funnel, so to speak.
Yeah, I love that. I'm thinking about trends that pop up, some that have these viral moments. Sometimes the moments are like a millisecond, right? Like right now at the time of this recording, many folks on social media are talking about how we can be very mindful, very demure, very, very cutesy, right?
Yeah.
Which I
It'll be
love.
gone next week.
We don't know, right? It might be gone next week. But, one trend in particular that I have found to be fascinating is this trend around GLP-1 drugs, or Ozempic is the big one that is noticeable. And I know here, August 2024, we might be a little bit past that trend being something that folks talk about, but I know I was out shopping this weekend and I saw an ad for a GLP-1 drug, like a printed ad on a billboard. And I was like, wow, this is an example of a trend that is like sticking. And so I'd love to talk about trends, because you'd written a post on LinkedIn a while back about how GLP-1 was impacting digestive health products, and how some other products or categories are seeing lifts as a result of this move towards Ozempic, essentially towards folks using these GLP-1 drugs. So I'd love to talk about viral moments here on the podcast because it's so relevant. But I'd love for you to just talk about how brands can kind of look at trends like these and either plan to jump on it. If you think there are ways for brands to be able to identify if something is going to have a little more lasting power, like GLP-1, which I would say is not like a flash in the pan. This seems like it's going to be here for a while, versus other things that might be, here today, gone tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah, no, great question. I think, especially as insights managers, I think we really try to think through, is it a here today trend, or is it something that's going to be more, long-term staying power? And, one thing I really like to do, when I'm kind of thinking about the categories that I work in and whatnot is, what are kind of the long-term macro trends, macro tailwinds, so to speak, that could be supporting whatever trend it is that I'm trying to evaluate. And I know beauty's a little bit of a different beast, right, in terms of how quickly things change and whatnot. But, I try to look at it, through the lens of, again, kind of those long macro trends that we're seeing that really have the potential to shape something big for a long point in time, right? So I think about right now in the U.S., with GLP-1s, right? We know that the U.S. has, a high obesity rate compared to other countries. We know that the U.S., is kind of I'll call it a pill popping society, or they want like a quick fix for a problem. And I also think about obviously watching GLP-1s go, kind of this democratizing of healthcare that GLP-1s specifically have experienced. I don't know if you've seen this, but if you're familiar with the brand Hims and Hers, they kind of got into more, kind of men's health and wellness products, prescription, but they've launched a GLP-1 product. Weight Watchers is also involved in GLP-1. I just saw the other day that Eli Lilly, one of the makers of these GLP-1s, is doing a direct-to-consumer website for their GLP-1 product. So, watching kind of a lot of these different trends all kind of converge tells me that this, as long as the government doesn't step in from a regulatory standpoint, this has the potential to be a very big trend over the next couple of years, and to continue to impact, both consumers on the pharmaceutical side of the business, but then also more on the OTC health and wellness side
overall
of the
business.
Wellness,
yeah.
We've talked about fashion before, right? In terms of the amount of people changing clothing sizes and whatnot. I mean, it could have far-reaching implications. I've seen different articles that talk about how much airlines could save on fuel consumption based on the changes of their passenger weight. So it's far-reaching, right? It's not just in our little sphere of influence over here. But, to get to your question, I think about, what are some of the implications for brands, thinking about some of these trends that could be, either quick kind of appearing and then also burning out, but then also more long-term trends. I think one, how do you think about, kind of scenario planning, right? Trying to expect multiple different adoption levels for certain types of products, especially we're thinking about GLP-1s. How do we think about if I looked up the number before we got on the call here, around 6% of the US population is using a GLP-1 at the moment. Yeah, it's pretty high.
I said what, but I was on mute. I am shocked for folks who might be watching the video. That's like a significant portion.
Yeah.
And I'm over here, trying to make time to do push-ups and squats and, wow.
Yeah. So I think, one kind of scenario planning right now, we're at 6%. What does it go if it goes to 10%? What does it go if it goes to 15%? I mean, I know that the obesity rate in the US is much higher than both of those. So there's a lot of headroom, right, in terms of this to continue to grow.
And then what are the other products that come out of that? Because I've read articles that talked about Ozempic face, how the fat loss in the face, like I have chubby cheeks, always have. And so what does that look like if you're saying, okay, I lost something there? What are folks getting? Are they going to buy more beauty products with collagen because they now want to try to replace some of the collagen that was lost or from the fat loss? Like there are other things that could potentially become bigger trends as a result of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just overall shifts in how people are trying to think about their diet and their wellness and there's certain things that you experience with GLP-1s, right? You need to eat more protein. You're dehydrated a lot of the time. You have digestive problems because it slows down your digestive system. So there's a lot of different products that you'll kind of need to support you on this journey. So I think, if brands can kind of think about that, I just want to give a little tidbit from some of the work that I've done within digestive health, right? Working with category managers, kind of, planning out some of the different digestive segments, whether it be hydration or laxatives or things like that. We've kind of talked to some of these category managers about, their shelf space and thinking about how much to dedicate, based on some of these, demand shifts that we're seeing. But you really have to start to think about some of these things because it's pretty profound, some of the impacts that these trends can have on a business.
Wow. That's fascinating. This is also why insights is one of my most favorite topics when I'm talking retail, because it's like the merge of like product and consumer behavior. It's so cool to me. So staying on the topic of things that I've seen and talking insights, another thing that I've seen a lot of recently are these unexpected collaborations. So I can't remember what time last year, maybe it was the spring of this year or the winter of last year, maybe fall of last year. I saw like Native do some Girl Scout stuff, and it was like Native deodorant company, right? For those of you who don't know, body care, personal care, but deodorant was their kind of core product. And they teamed up with Girl Scouts. I've got a home full of Girl Scouts over here. And so we're looking at them and going, oh, Samoas and trefoils, and this is so cool. And I saw that those products ended up coming in line. And this was before I even thought about, this question and talking about this, but I also saw some interesting other call outs. Burt's Bees, ex Hidden Valley Ranch. So that's like chapstick crossing over with like ranch dressing. Absolute and Kahlua, Vacation in Arizona. Are these collaborations just like fun ways for brands to spice things up? Do you have any insights to share on what makes some of these collaborations more successful? And then lastly, I'd love to know if there's a collaboration that you'd like to see, just like a fun question, because I'd love to hear it.
I have to say this was probably my most look forward to question of this whole podcast. It's just a fun thing to try and think about, right? I mean, you just see so many creative ideas out there from these brands, and it's so fun to kind of investigate a little bit more. But what makes a successful collaboration? The first thing that comes to mind for me is really the brands having a shared value or a shared audience. Trying to think about living into the audience that they're already talking to, but maybe expanding out a little bit past that. But there's still a lot of synergies between, the two brands. And I think the other thing too, in a similar vein, is it has to feel authentic and it has to feel not just opportunistic, right? You kind of said, is it just a flash in the pan? Like, oh, maybe we can grow some more sales. But I think it has to be more than that. I think today consumers are expecting more from brands in terms of authenticity and trust and transparency. And I think it has to deliver on that. So I think that would be number one. I think to your point earlier, there has to be kind of this novelty / surprise factor to it, right? It has to be kind of fun. It has to drive that consumer interest, media coverage related to it. And I think, for brands that are really thinking about stepping outside of the box, I think it's a really exciting way to kind of be creative as a brand and really think about, how do you go and build your audience slightly bigger than what you have today. My example, kind of to your point about some, kind of fun novelty collaborations, I saw recently that Elf Cosmetics and Liquid Death being the water brand, did a collaboration, which is pretty interesting, right? You don't necessarily think about those two going together, but I mean, the social media buzz around it was just crazy. And I think that's really, if you can get something that goes viral, which Elf Cosmetics seems to, actually both of them really.
They're so good at that, right?
They are. Both of them have just mastered social media and really going after that younger demographic of consumers, and they're just both masters at it. But I think, for both of those brands, it really just elevates both of them. It's not like one is getting left behind in the dust. And I think the last point is kind of a build from the previous statement, but really, how do you think about social media amplification, right? We live in kind of this world nowadays where things, tend to go very demure, very mindful, right? Things can happen overnight and really be amplified at a really rapid fire rate. So how do we think about brands thinking, how do you generate buzz? How do you think about generating engagement with consumers, delivering it in a creative way? And you got to have the right assets and whatnot in place in order for those to go viral. I think it's a really, really interesting things that brands are doing, in order to really elevate both of the brands in the partnership. It's not, it's not just about one of the brands. It's not an opportunistic thing. It's really about kind of building a community almost for a certain target or demographic, so to speak.
That's really good, Zach. And I think as I thought about a fun collaboration myself, just because I love this stuff like Product Girl all the way. I'm like, I would love to see a brand team up with Bubble Yum and call it, because I'm a geriatric millennial and nostalgia, but I feel like I'm thinking like a Sol de Janeiro across Bubble Yum. Like, come on, the colors, the scent profiles that you could do. Give me an elevated watermelon. Give me an elevated, like, tropical punch. Like, I just think it would be so fun. I'm thinking of the photography that you could come out with it. I mean, all I'll say is, I won't get any money for it, but I think it's a great idea. Just saying.
No, I love it. See, I think with your challenge to me, I think I went the opposite direction. I'll tell you mine. So mine was, and I think it's probably because I picked two of my favorite brands that I engage with. Uniqlo, right? The clothing brand, kind of functional, quality, basics clothing brand. And The Ordinary skincare brand, really that kind of science-driven.
I love it.
No
the aesthetics are so good. You're right, Zach.
Yeah. I just feel like, and maybe it's because I want to simplify my shopping experience, right? I think about like if The Ordinary had some kind of like grab and go skincare set and in a Uniqlo store, I could just grab it and go and didn't have to think about it and go to Sephora. Maybe I was just being lazy, but I just think those two, there's kind of a synergy, right? Two totally different categories, but there's definitely a synergy in terms of like how consumers are kind of thinking about the types of products that they want to engage with, right? It's kind of simple, no nonsense, great quality. But I think that there could be a lot of collaboration there that would actually go really well for both of the brands.
Yeah. I love it.
No crazy colors, no crazy scents, just.
But that's the fun of these collaborations, right? Like, they can go in a variety of directions depending on who the different collaborators are. So I love that our ideas for who could be the next two collaborations were so opposite end of the spectrum, because it just shows like, but think about what kind of engagement you would get even from a Uniqlo X The Ordinary. Yeah. Like that simplistic, capsule wardrobe girl guy person is like all over it. Like, yes, this is what I've been needing in my life. And then on the other side, right, it's like Sol de Janeiro X Bubble Yum is going to be like so much fun, so much nostalgia. Give me a Polaroid camera, like, or the cameras like with the photos that you used to look in and look up at the light. I don't know if you remember those. I'm dating myself, but that's okay. Look, Zach, this was a really awesome conversation. I love these conversations about insights. I think it's so cool to just see how quickly things are shifting and moving in retail. And I guess just in closing, I'd love to just say, if you have any other words of advice for emerging brands or anything else that you'd like to share, feel free.
Yeah, no, thanks obviously for the opportunity, just to kind of wrap up here. But, I think the one thing that I leave brands with, and I think, we as insights managers and leaders try to really live into ourselves is, always be curious and always be learning, right? Whether it's whatever consumers are doing next, whatever retailers are doing next, whatever some of these, ecosystems, social media is doing next. I think you always have to be curious and you always have to be, willing to learn whatever that next thing is. You can never be static and always just be willing to try new things because you never know what's going to work for the brand. Some of these collaborations that we just touched on, you never know what's going to drive, new consumers to the brand or new usage occasions or whatnot. So I think you have to be constantly willing to learn and keep trying new things to reach new consumers in new need states. But I think that would be my closing point. But, thank you again, Monique.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you so much.
Thank you again to Zach for joining me on the show today. I hope that you all enjoyed our conversation and would love to hear if you all have any mashups that you'd like to see with some of your favorite brands in terms of collaborations. As always, if you found this helpful, please share this with a friend or a colleague. Leave us a review on Apple iTunes or on Spotify podcasts. And as always, I'll catch you on the next episode and this time, the next season. Thanks for listening. Bye.